What's up, boys? This video is a headache. I hope that I have consolidated enough information to not make it seem like as much of a headache as it truly was. Basically, what we're going to go over today is a continuation of our elemental reaction series, where we're kind of trying to get a deeper understanding of how all of this stuff works. First and foremost, if you come across this video and you've never seen an elemental reaction video by me, I highly encourage you to check out the playlist. I will have it probably in a card over there. That compass may turn into a card, but I highly encourage you to check out the previous videos, because we're basically building off top of the ideas that were already discussed in those videos to make sense of everything that we have in this video. But as a brief summary of what we've gone over so far, basically how elemental reactions are set up in this game, i.e. how they react with each other, electro plus cryo equals superconduct, for example. We've gone over how to calculate damage, both physical and reaction-based damage. And we've talked about the elemental gauge theory, talking about how specific skills have specific units of gauge that they apply, and how the decay rates of each unit factors into how many reactions you could do and stuff like that. In the most recent video, we specifically talked about melt, vaporize, superconduct, and overload. And that was about the extent that I could cover without making the video drag on and on forever. I did promise that we would go over the other reactions in a separate video. I do think that we should probably cap this all off with a video of elemental mastery versus attack, because that was kind of the original intention for learning all of this stuff. So without further ado, let's go ahead and hop into the first reaction that we're going to talk about today, which was Crystallize. Now, I had originally set all of this up to be basically in order from least headache to most headache. I started recording this video like 2 days ago, and then quickly realized that Crystallize needs a little bit more research done on it. I spent 2 days filming a bunch of different scenarios and different levels and stuff like that. So if you remember from talking about, I think this was in like the third video that is in the playlist, it's literally about just the reactions and how we calculate damage for them. Crystallize is a transformative based reaction, which means it scales based off of your elemental mastery, your level, and the resistance of the enemy. Crystallize is kind of a little bit more nuanced than that, because the resistance of the enemy technically does play into a factor, but it's not going to play into a factor of the shields from what I can tell. Again, Crystallize, being the first one in this video, was originally intentioned to be the least headache inducing, but I quickly realized that there's not been a ton of research done on Crystallize outside of, hey, here's how we basically know that it works. But basically how we know that it works versus how it actually works is what I really wanted to understand. I was able to find a ton of basic shield strength values that people have calculated. This was on a Chinese forum that Google Translate kindly translated for me, but I still couldn't really get a huge grasp on where these actual numbers come from, but I can kind of show you where these come from. So if we actually take a look here at this clip, this is going to be 0 elemental mastery, Ningguang at level 61. So the first thing we need to do is say that this particular clip has 0 elemental mastery on Ningguang, and we are at level 61. So the first thing that we need to figure out is how much damage the Hill Troll is actually going to do to us. You'll notice he's level 80, all that stuff like we would typically talk about, except we're only worried about Crystallize. So the only thing that we actually need to figure out is our elemental mastery and our level. We're going to see he does 976 points of damage, which we are going to add up in the top left-hand corner. Next, we need to create a Crystallize reaction. So you'll notice that right here, when I pick up the crystal, it looks like he is actually taking damage when I pick it up. But if you notice that little purple orb that's flying close to him, that's Eye Perception. It's the passive from Eye Perception. He's not actually taking any damage. You can see he takes the damage way before I pick up the crystal. And just want to make sure that that's clear, that Crystallize doesn't do any damage to the enemy. So you'll see we now have a water-based shield, a hydro-based elemental shield, and we're going to see how much damage he does. Now you'll notice he does 61 points of damage to Ningguang. So from that, we can deduce that the total amount of damage that he normally would do, 976, minus the 61 damage that he actually did, is 915. That means that in this scenario, for 0 elemental mastery and a level 61 Ningguang, we have a shield strength of 915. So if we actually go to our spreadsheet here and we say 61, you can see our shield strength should be 915. Now, when we throw Elemental Mastery into the mix, it does change things. So we're basically going to follow the same path here. We're going to see how much damage he does. 976 damage. Okay. Should be the exact same. But now we're going to proc our Crystallize. And we're going to see how much damage he does after. You'll notice he does 33 points of damage. So the 33 is now factored in as 976 damage minus the 33 that we actually took, which means the shield actually absorbed 943 points of damage. So what changed? So if we take and put level 61 and we had 10 elemental mastery in that particular instance, you'll see that the shield strength should actually increase to 946. Now we had 943, so of course there's a slight variance just because of the formulas that we're using and stuff like that, but you can kind of see that the shield strength does actually increase because of your elemental mastery. And it's not because my original thought was that the elemental mastery only increased the shield strength if we were proficient against that opposite element. For instance, if we had a pyro shield and we were getting hit by a pyro slime, we would then increase the proficiency of our shield and be able to tank more pyro damage. But elemental mastery actually increases all of the damage incoming by that elemental mastery bonus, not just the actual element that you've crystallized, but there is a bonus for the element that you crystallize. So we can kind of see here, we're going to have a different example, except this time we're going to be going up against cryo slimes. So you'll notice here, our first hit, that means we take 618 cryo damage from this exact slime scenario. So all level 78s, all the same damage going to be incoming. Since we have 0 elemental mastery, we are assuming that we're not getting that extra 3% from the 10 elemental mastery that we would normally get. But how tanky is the shield? Well, we took 1 hit, 2 hits, 3 hits, and 4 hits. And you'll notice we took an extra 232 cryo damage after that. So what does that end up meaning? Well, this particular cryo shield took 4 hits of 618 damage. So we multiply that out, and then we minus the 232 that we ended up taking afterwards for a total shield strength of 2,240. Now, in this specific case, we are actually level 60. Some of these that I recorded were before I leveled them up to level 61 and some were after. So this particular one is at level 60, which means that our level 60 here, elemental mastery was 0. Our shield strength with the proficiency bonus was 2,245. So relatively close. So let's take another example with our elemental mastery at 10, still at level 60, still the exact same scenario. So you'll see here, just to make sure, still 618 on the damage. We took 1 hit, 2 hit, 3 hit, 4 hit with 163 left over. So that ends up meaning 4 times 618 for the total times that we were hit, minus the extra 163 that we took over is 2309. So now if we change that to 10, we have 2316. So we're about 5 points off on our exact numbers. And there are probably going to be quite a few combinations of higher elemental mastery numbers that throw this thing a little bit further off. You may encounter stuff that's like maybe 20 or 30 points off in some areas, but it's kind of as close as we can get right now. And we didn't really have like a base shield strength formula. Most of these numbers came from a Chinese theory crafter that did all the math on like exactly at level 1 they took 91 base damage, like all that stuff. They went through and did that. I was the one that came up with a polynumeral based equation pretty much that just takes all of this stuff and your level, and it just tries to get as close to the expected result as possible. But you can see some of these are completely out, like 159 versus 194, stuff like that. It just, yeah, some of them are really close, but some of them are really stretched. I'm trying to figure out if maybe MiHoYo thinks of each ascension step as if it was its own separate formula. That would kind of be interesting if they did that. but I'll have to do some more testing to see if that's true. Some other things that you may want to know about Crystallize: Geo can only ever be the trigger element for Crystallize to take place. You can't ever put a Geo aura onto a target. Outside of the Geo hypostasis, there shouldn't be many things in the game that actually have that aura, and even if they do, then you would create Crystallize by doing some sort of elemental reaction to them. But we, as Ningguang, Noel, MC, whatever, Zhongli, you can't actually put a Geo element onto an enemy. It will always end up being the trigger element. Now, when it comes to the actual Crystallize reaction, it removes half of a unit from your aura, which is kind of interesting. If you remember back to Vaporize and Melt, if we did a weaker reaction, so if we did Pyro on top of Hydro to perform Vaporize, it would only remove half as much of the gauge from the Hydro. Well, Crystallize works the exact same way, where if we have a 2U of Pyro and we perform Crystallize, it only removes half of a gauge unit from that Pyro aura, which is pretty interesting. And of course, as we just saw, the Elemental Mastery does actually affect the damage absorption of the shield, even outside of the actual element that you pick up. It will soak up extra damage on top of just whatever its base shielding strength is going to be. So now let's actually talk about Swirl. So Swirl is another very, very interesting elemental reaction, because Swirl is not super powerful to begin with, but it has the capabilities to do some pretty nutty stuff. So for Swirl to take place, we basically need an aura element on a target, and then we need to perform any attack that is Anemo based. Just like in Crystallize, Swirl will only remove half of a gauge unit from the reaction, and then once Swirl actually does occur, the target will take damage from the Anemo skill that we use to perform Swirl, and then they will take Swirl damage on top of that. All right, so we're gonna take a look at another clip here really quick. So for Swirl, so the natural path of the damage for an Anemo skill is, at first, we basically need to have an enemy or a target that has the aura element applied to them. In this case, you can see we have two different Hilichurls. We have one with Pyro on the bottom, and we have one with Hydro on the top. Then we would actually have our Anemo ability. In this case, it's gonna be Venti's elemental skill. So what we'll see is the Hydro has actually already fallen off of the Hilichurl on the right. The Hilichurl on the left still actually has Pyro on him. So if we back up here, we can see the first thing that we get is the damage that is actually done from our elemental skill. In this scenario, it is 2,798. Then Swirl, the actual text of the Swirl shows up, and we actually then get to see the Swirl damage that is performed afterwards. So that 1435 and 1123 is actually going to be the damage from the Swirl reaction. Essentially what we're seeing here is that the Swirl reaction takes the element of the aura, and then it applies a separate attack essentially on top of the normal Anemo damage. And then, since we have two enemies in the same area and both of them are able to be affected by this, you can see that the enemy on the right, who had no aura, actually ends up taking Pyro damage because it transfers that element to other targets in the vicinity. Now, what we're left with here is Hilichurl A, who now has no aura remaining, and now we have Hilichurl B on the right, who actually does have a Pyro aura. The reason that they are stuck in this state is because we've removed enough gauge from Hilichurl A to get rid of the aura, but now we have given that aura by transferal to Hilichurl B. So now let's look at another scenario, and this is kind of where I think Swirl gets its biggest potential spike in damage. So essentially on the left-hand side, we have a Hilichurl that has Pyro, and on the right-hand side, we have a Hilichurl that has Hydro. If we were to use an Anemo-based attack, you'll actually get Swirl damage, but not only are they going to receive Swirl damage, but because of the transferal of the auras, it's actually going to end up making a flat-out reaction from those two auras. So as we can see here, we end up getting the transferal of pyro onto the hydro, which ends up meaning that on the left-hand side, we end up having 4,720 because our Anemo-based attack actually crits. And then we actually have 1,435, which is the amount of damage that the Swirl actually induces because he had an aura element on him. So he's kind of taking, in sense, you could kind of think of it as he's double dipping on the damage, even though the damages are two totally separate numbers, right? And then on the right-hand side, he actually doesn't even take Anemo-based damage, probably just because he wasn't close enough in this scenario. But the transferal ends up moving some pyro aura over to him, and he ends up taking vaporized damage. Now, I'm 99% sure in this scenario, the reason that he takes 2,593 is because the pyro was applied on top of hydro. Potentially, it could be more. These transferals and the reactions that are done outside of Swirl, there's a few things that can and cannot crit when it comes to these Swirl-based reactions. But nonetheless, it's really freaking cool that you can transfer auras over to other characters and stuff like that. I really think that's where Swirl in general just gets a huge, huge spike in its potential. And you can see because everything has reacted and everything is basically done and over with, the Swirl ended up removing enough of the aura off of Hilichurl A to remove his pyro aura completely. And the Vaporize ended up removing enough aura to remove the hydro aura on the right-hand side. Therefore, we have no auras left. Just some quick notes about the transferal and stuff like that though. The transfer can only end up affecting a single target 2 separate times. Essentially, at best case scenario, even if we had a group of 10 different enemies closed in and each of them had a different set of auras on them, if they were all, just kind of random auras, even if we ended up dropping an Anemo-based skill or anything like that. So in a case where we have multiple enemies that are close by, even though there's a ton of different things that apply there, whenever you see Swirl pop up, every enemy can only be affected by Swirl up to 2 separate times, and that's it. So even in a situation where you have a group of like 10 or 20 different enemies, each enemy can only take 2 instances of damage from the Swirl. Now there are also scenarios where Anemo skills can technically absorb elements. So if we actually pop Venti's ult here, Venti's ult is one of those that can. You'll notice that Venti's ult starts out as Anemo-based damage and then shifts into Hydro-based damage, which is very, very interesting. And you'll notice that even though this Hilichurl, well, he has one now, this Cryo Hilichurl here, even though he doesn't have any aura on him, by the time all of this stuff starts reacting, Venti's ult ends up adding in a hydro element to everything, which ends up giving an hydro aura to everything that's involved, which is actually pretty interesting. So in this scenario, we're going to hit Venti's ult, and you'll notice that as soon as it's kind of hard to showcase this, but as soon as the Abyss Mage ends up getting in touch with something that ends up having the hydro aura, he gains it. But Venti's ult can specifically transfer that as well. Now, some important things to note about the damage absorption that's happening here. Some common things that you'll notice that have this absorption are things like the burst from Venti, Sucrose's elemental burst, and even Traveler's elemental burst as well. The skill from Traveler technically can absorb the element if you just sit there and hold it. It is a little bit more difficult to sometimes showcase that just because of how channeled and how small and narrow that actual skill is, but it can actually absorb, and you will end up doing pyro damage if you absorb the pyro element over your Anemo-based damage. And then we have, just because a skill doesn't have absorption doesn't mean that it won't apply any kind of swirl damage. The only requirements for the absorption to take place, as long as the skill has that ability, is that the skill actually has to hit the target, and that target has to have an aura on it. Once the element is actually absorbed, it does then start applying that new element as the damage instead of the Anemo-based damage. And last but not least, it's kind of theorized and we're pretty certain at this point that one and only one element can be absorbed, and the element that ends up being the one that gets absorbed seems to be the first element that comes in contact with the centermost point of that skill. So in the cases of Venti's ult, you know, how it kind of moves enemies up and down like that, the first enemy that crosses through the true center of that, Sucrose, whoever touches the butterfly first, things like that. Okay, so I'm actually going to kind of put a pin in this for this specific video. You guys can actually see I have roughly like 30 more minutes worth of footage to cut down, but this video that you're currently watching is currently sitting at roughly 20 minutes, and I don't want to overload you guys with a ton of information. I want to make this a little bit more bite-sized so that it's not overwhelming. But I did cover both Crystallize and Swirl in this particular video. In the next video, we're going to go over Frozen, which also covers Shattered, and then we'll also talk about Electrocharged and how it kind of works with two separate auras on the same target, which kind of breaks everything in terms of like the protocols that we have for elemental reactions. But I'm going to leave this here. Hopefully you guys are okay with that. Hopefully you guys enjoyed watching this video and got at least something out of it that is at least halfway entertaining and knowledgeable for you guys, because at the end of the day, knowledge is power. That's why I'm trying to do this. Hopefully you guys have a good rest of your afternoon, morning, day, night, wherever you are. See ya. Major shout out to Cherry Blue, who is a YouTube member.